A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time, while the poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. And, that's the whole thing, isn't it?
This is Wicked Problems. I'm Richard Delavan.
Terry Pratchett called it the Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness, and I adjusted that in the piece to the solar panel theory. The transition at the moment is this battle between these immense macro forces of the technology curve and the S-curve adoption, bumping into NIMBYs and planning constraints and market failures. Who's going to win that fight will determine whether we're on track for a 1.6, 1.7 degree world or a 2.8, 2.93 degree world. They stormed the stage and protested during one of our sessions, which, feels a bit strange when you've got a net zero event and you're trying to advance the net zero cause and you're getting attacked for doing so.
Somewhere in the afterlife, Gore Vidal and Oscar Wilde are fighting over credit for the line, "When someone you admire succeeds, a little part of you dies." James Murray is kind of the OG of climate tech journalism. He started as editor of Business Green around the same time that I was the business editor of a paper in Ireland, covering some of the same topics, difference being that James has stuck with it. And the results have been dramatic. He's one of the most respected commentators and thinkers on the subject, and has built Business Green into a must-read publication without losing his sense of humor, or indeed his sense of what's important. Last year we met at the Net Zero Festival James organized, where he offered an entirely unplanned masterclass on how to deal with Extinction Rebellion protesters at his event. How would you deal with that? Would you keep your cool? That kind of moment is revealing about character. Last week, during a Broadway production of Ibsen's Enemy of the People, a Succession star, Jeremy Strong, found himself dealing with a similar XR performance interruption. We were going to try to do something fancy with Latin and something interrupto, but that didn't really work out. Anyway, here's what happened in Broadway.
I object. I object to the silencing of scientists. I am very, very sorry to interrupt your night and this amazing performance.
I'm sorry, you need to leave.
You're throwing my career under the bus.
Now get him out.
Our water is poison.
We got somebody.
Where's the house manager?
They do not have the floor.
The oceans are acidifying. The oceans are rising. It will swallow this city and this entire theater whole. I am putting my career on the line because we are not doing anything about this crisis. The water is coming for us. Broadway will not survive on a dead planet. There is no Broadway on a dead planet. There is no...
He's right. They won't do anything to stop you from learning the truth. You gotta write your own play. You understand that?
Is he fighting them?
You got to go. You got to go. You got to go.
We're going to go see the Matt Smith version in the West End on Friday, and we'll keep a lookout to see if any XR folks stage a similar intervention. But James handled this so well, it's now taught in classes for media and presentation training here in the UK, because it's hard to see how he could have handled it better. Balancing respect for the right to protest with respect to the audience who came to hear the thing that James was putting on. To me, that just proved the kind of guy James is. In this conversation, we talk a bit about that, look forward to this year's event, his Terry Pratchett-inspired view of climate tech socioeconomic inequality, from which the next government of whatever stripe should take a lesson. If you're enjoying these conversations, and you can afford to chip in a bit to our tip jar in the form of a monthly subscription at wickedproblems.earth, it costs less than the price of a pint in central London. Though do email us and we'd be happy to accept that too, in person. For now, here's my conversation with James Murray, editor of Business Green. Hope you enjoy. James Murray, editor-in-chief of Business Green, welcome to Wicked Problems.
Thanks for having me. Look forward to it.
So glad you could join us. I've been trying to get you on the show, I think, certainly since the Net Zero Festival last year. And great you could make the time.
Yeah, no, it was great to meet you there. It was, we were really pleased with how the event went. We had nearly 3,000 people registered, I think, and it was a good few days. Yeah, a celebration of all things net zero.
And a great, I mean, I'm not wrong in thinking that it was Joanna Lumley who was your surprise guest in the end, wasn't it?
Yeah, so we had Alistair Campbell at the end of day one. Podcasting's Alistair Campbell, as he is now known, and then we had Joanna Lumley closing the show, and she was just absolutely fantastic, just an inspirational performer, and really does care passionately about green causes. So it was it was a fun couple of days.
Okay. Well, and obviously there was a unplanned, unscripted moment that happened, and we'll come back to that because that was one of the things that we were just talking in the green room before this about. I think how you handled that incident was something that certainly a lot of people in the communications business in the UK have learned from as a masterclass about how to do that. But let's come back to that. I reached out because I saw your February 22nd piece, which I thought was wonderful, using Terry Pratchett as a way of explaining some of the challenges about the energy transition and climate tech more generally. So can I hand over to you and maybe just take us through that piece and what the argument was?
Yeah,
there?
So it was a piece that ran on one of our newsletters that we have for Business Green subscribers, the overnight briefing, and every day I sort of try and write something about what was in the news that day. And there was this report out from the Nuffield Foundation, and like a lot of these kind of think tank reports, it had a really catchy title. It was about transition poverty, is what it referred to, with regards to the net zero transition. And it was a really interesting report because it's something I do think is overlooked a bit too much by the environmental movement and green businesses. And it was making this argument that the net zero transition will create lots of winners, but it will also create losers, and there will be the risk of what could be perceived as this transition poverty, that the costs of certain things will go up as we shift away from a kind of the fossil fuel economy. And it was quite a compelling argument. And of course, that's an argument that has been seized on, and we've heard a lot from kind of opponents of climate action, and climate skeptics have kind of weaponized that argument. And the Nuffield Foundation weren't saying that at all. They were saying net zero targets are absolutely critical. If we let climate change continue, then poorer communities, both globally and in the UK, will suffer the most. This is a progressive agenda that will benefit the poor and benefit everyone. We're all on the same planet. We all need to manage changes. So they were in no way saying we should water down our net zero targets for our decarbonisation efforts. What they were saying was that the policies and the investments that do that need to be designed in a way that recognises that there is this transition poverty. And I sort of tied that argument together with some other recent reports that have been done, kind of more positive reports that show that if you're deploying clean technologies, you can now realise really, really significant savings. Like I think there was an Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit report that reckoned that you could save nearly £2,000 a year on your energy bill, on your running costs, if you had an electric vehicle, an energy efficient house, solar panels on your roof, and a heat pump. You could save £2,000 a year. That's a lot of money. And those savings are available now. You can realise those now. But of course, the problem with that is you have to buy those things in the first place. So we are getting to this situation where it is wealthier communities that can allow it. And, it just did strike me of a reminder of this now quite famous, very memeable Terry Pratchett quote about the Boots theory of poverty. And he called it the Boots theory of socioeconomic unfairness. And I adjusted that in the piece to the solar panel theory of socioeconomic unfairness. But shall I read it out, actually? Because it's a wonderful bit of writing. Terry Pratchett, what's the book called? It's In Men at Arms, the play. He says, "The reason that the rich were so rich," Vimes reasoned, "was because they managed to spend less money. Take Boots, for example. He earns $38 a month plus allowances. A really good pair of leather boots cost $50. But an affordable pair of boots, which were sort of okay for a season or two and then leaked like hell when the cardboard gave out, cost about $10. Those were the kind of boots Vimes always bought and wore until the soles were so thin that he could tell where he was in Ankh-Morpork on a foggy night by the feel of the cobbles. But the thing was that the good boots lasted for years and years. A man who could afford $50 had a pair of boots that'd still be keeping his feet dry in 10 years' time. while the poor man who could only afford cheap boots would have spent $100 on boots in the same time and would still have wet feet. And that's the whole thing, isn't it? I mean, it's that piece from, I think it was the early 90s, is now taught in economic classes, and it is very, very true. There's this immense unfairness baked into the system, and that absolutely applies to the clean energy transition. We are seeing that already happening, that the benefits that flow from these technologies currently aren't being shared as widely as we would like. And of course, there are risks with that, because you'll get the backlash, you'll get the political opposition, you get these opportunists who come in and say, well, the whole thing doesn't work. We need to ditch it because it's penalising poor people. It's not really penalising poor people, it's benefiting everyone, but the costs and benefits are not being as evenly shared as arguably they should.
And I think that kind of argumentation around the costs and who pays is something that does wind up being weaponized by people who have other perhaps motives for wanting to slow things down. I was reading I haven't listened to it yet, but I see that the Fortune podcast was talking to someone from Exxon. So the dirty secret of the transition is this, is so how much it's going to cost and who's going to pay for it. Which is just an argument to basically say that we can't afford to do this. Whereas, in fact, if you change that argument to say, well, the dirty little secret of defeating the Nazis is that it's going to cost a lot and who's going to have to pay for that, you just wouldn't really consider that to be something is top of your mind, top of priority list, if it was that important.
Oh, no, absolutely. I mean, it is, it has to be seen in those regards. This is an investment. We need to make that investment. I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, I touched on this in the piece. There's a couple of things that strike me about it. I mean, one is every single technology and industrial transition has been like this. This is not a new problem or a new thing. And there's even an argument that, is it? I mean, obviously, it is unfair and there is an inequity there, but those inequities are kind of baked into our economy. This is not a net zero problem. This is a, modern capitalist economy problem. And that point of how this is how it's always worked. You've always had, if you go back, the most recent technology transition was the digital one. And then in the post-war period, you had kind of the consumer goods transition with television and radio and automotive. And before that, you had sort of the Industrial Revolution. But in all of those periods, the first mobile phones were bought by tech-savvy, wealthy early adopters. And they filtered down a bit into the kind of the wealthier upper middle class area. And then they got a bit cheaper and they went more ubiquitous amongst the middle class. And then the economies of scale came in and they became ubiquitous. And that's exactly what's happened with cars, with televisions, with phones, etc., etc. And that is what will happen with solar panels. And there is a sense of, should we be beating ourselves up too much about this as a specific net zero problem when, the wider issues of poverty are much more ingrained into every part of the issue. And we could talk for hours and hours about how that should be tackled and some of the challenges there. So I think that there's definitely there's that side of it. We don't want to overstate this, but then you're right. The problem is it will get weaponized, and if we want to build support for the transition as a whole, then you need the benefits and the costs to be shared fairly. And those are just policy decisions. There are ways of doing this. There are ways of spreading the cost fairly. I mean, that's what progressive taxation is ultimately for. There's also the sense that a lot of this is going to be driven by the private sector. Those financing packages will be taken out at the macro scale, and they will invest in the infrastructure that we need. And then over time, the costs will come down for everyone. So I worry that I go back and forth between, are we sort of overstating this problem and risk exaggerating it and playing into the hands of those who want to insist this is all a cost, when in fact, it is an investment, and there's already evidence of it bringing down costs over time and enhancing energy security. But then also recognising that some of the policies have been badly designed and some of the costs aren't as fairly shared as they should be. And we should be asking those with the broadest shoulders to pay more towards those upfront investments.
And I think that, I suppose one of the reasons, again, I was keen to get you on the show at some point is because, 17 years ago, let's say, when you were getting started in this role, and I was actually the business editor of a paper over in Ireland, writing about green tech, covering green tech, and we were, I suppose, there were a few of us doing it at the time. but you've been able to stick with it. In my case, life and a couple of things got in the way, and I got shunted into doing something else for a few years. But in your case, you've had this view going back to the mid-aughts in terms of how policies have rolled out and shaped, and the technology learning curves and rights law have affected all these different parts of the sector. And I suppose we're sitting here talking a couple days after the latest budget, perhaps the last one from this government, came out. How, taking the broad view about whether or not you think that, broadly speaking, the UK remains on track to keep a leadership position in rolling out some of these policies, addressing some of the inequities that we've just been talking about, and also nurturing a domestic industry that's going to be able to continue to produce the kinds of goods and services that are going to help the transition move forward?
Oh, that's a big question. I mean, where do we stand currently? It really is. It's a classic kind of, it is the curate's egg thing of some parts of it are good and some parts of it are bad. And of course, the punchline to that is that it's an egg. So if some parts of it are bad, the whole egg is bad. So there is always, that's the kind of context. The caveat is always that we're never going fast enough. No economy's going fast enough. But, it is true that the UK is still a leader, and there's definitely areas in which we are really impressive. So, the UK has decarbonised faster than any other G20 economy since 2010. The government doesn't get enough credit for that, although the government doesn't seem to want the credit because it doesn't want to talk about it that much, because its backbenchers get upset about anything to do with climate action. So we can maybe not give them too much sympathy. But, there's been real progress, and we are leaders in areas such as offshore wind in particular. I mean, that is, the UK is the world's premier offshore wind power and is aiming to continue to be. We phased out coal really, really quickly in the end. We proved that you can shut down these big fossil fuel power plants and not jeopardise energy security and not send energy costs through the roof. You mentioned the people who are weaponising the current moment, but, they've been wrong over and over again. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that when we were talking about closing the coal plants, they were just like, well, there'll be blackouts. There were no blackouts. They were saying energy costs will soar. Well, energy costs have soared, but they've soared because of gas from Russia and the instability in the fossil fuel markets, not because of renewables. So, they're wrong time and time again, and I suspect they'll be wrong now with their current scare stories. But there are definitely areas in which we're leading. I mean, we're not leaders, but we're in the front few players in the electric vehicle transition. Again, that's just exploding, the pace at which that shift is happening. So there's lots of things of which I think the UK can be proud and will continue to build on. I mean, we're pretty good at green finance. We have the City of London. We've got some exceptional sort of research institutions. There's a really big pipeline of carbon capture and hydrogen projects that is still awaiting policy decisions that will allow investments to happen. But the pipeline is there, the foundations are there. That could be a huge area over the next decade. So there's lots of good stuff going on. The frustration with it is there's just so many areas where policy or a lack of foresight or, the underlying economic situation of just flatlining growth for the best part of 14 years now have undermined so many potential easy wins that have not been seized. And anyone who works in this space is well aware of them. Just like the onshore renewables space in the UK has been hamstrung at every step of the way by NIMBYism and planning constraints. The energy, we don't see nearly enough energy efficiency investment through lack of government-backed schemes and lack of tough regulation. The list goes on and on. I mean, we're finally starting to do something on more sustainable farming, but again, nowhere near as much as we could have done. I could talk for a whole hour about the missed opportunities, but they're there time and time again. And it comes back to what you just touched on, of that it's because ultimately it hasn't had the level of political prioritisation that was needed. It hasn't had people willing to go out there and make the case for investment. And, obviously the green economy is arguably the biggest loser from the way in which this kind of treasury brain austerity economics has dominated, and we've underinvested in our economy and our infrastructure on every single front. But that is felt particularly hard in the net zero transition, where the net zero transition is a finance challenge. It's about upfront investment to deliver savings tomorrow. It's renewables projects, energy efficiency, these are all things that deliver you better infrastructure that saves money over time, but they have high upfront capital cost. And that is a conundrum that should be resolvable, and we're seeing from China and the US Inflation Reduction Act and several other countries that there are ways of starting to resolve it. And particularly since 2016, but arguably since 2010, and arguably before that as well, we just haven't had governments willing to really make the case for that investment.
And I suppose the question I would have for you is, I mean, you probably saw Carbon Brief's report that they put out a couple of days ago, Simon Evans et al., with talking about, 4 gigatons of additional kind of carbon emissions that would result from a Trump, re-election happening. We're sitting here in the UK. I'm just looking at both parties, and particularly after, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer have downplayed their previously touted investment plans. We can argue about whether or not that was a good idea to go with that number in the first place, but the optics are terrible in the sense of having walked away from it. I mean, do you get a sense that it really matters in terms of, that political action is going to make a difference one way or the other in the pace of the transition here in the UK?
I go back and forth on this. I mean, in my more optimistic moments, I'd say not as much as you think. That, these technologies, particularly solar, you look at the IEA and Bloomberg New Energy Finance and all those charts that they can produce, and they just show over and over again, this is the fastest technology revolution in history in many ways. The things that have happened to the cost of solar power in particular are just mind-blowing. The cost of batteries on similar curves. Michael Liebrecht, at Bloomberg, founder of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, wrote 2 brilliant pieces in recent months. One on the bear case for net zero, and picked out the 5 big problems, and they are very scary problems that suggest we're not going to get there. And then he wrote the bull case, and he sort of said, here are the 5 reasons we're going to get there. And it is all about the exponential growth and the normalization of these technologies, and the fact the business case now stacks up. And things are going to change very, very fast. I mean, I think that is a given. I think there's going to be huge demand destruction in the fossil fuel industry. And in 10, 15 years' time, you're going to start to see modern industrial economies that are delivering deep and sustained emissions reduction. So that's the good news. The flip side of that is none of it's happening fast enough. Getting to 1.5 degree scenario is virtually, hesitate to say impossible, but it's not far off. And 2 degrees is staggeringly difficult. I mean, it is the scale of change that's needed, particularly in big emerging economies, is just off the charts. And we're not going fast enough. And the reason we're not going fast enough is the reason that's dogged the last 30, 40 years, is that there are fundamental market failures that don't put a sufficient price on the pollution, which means the market signals are all over the shop, and you find yourself locking in this polluting infrastructure that causes immense damage down the line, and could basically destroy us all, because these that's the other thing that's going to happen over the next 10, 15 years. The climate impacts are going to become more and more visible, more and more scary. So I really, I really worry about that. And when we have our events like the Net Zero Festival that you came to, whenever we're sort of planning the content, the conversation on the panels always goes the same way. It always ends coming back to policy and politics. And I'm also, as a chair, I'm trying to steer it away from that a little bit, because I'm thinking, oh God, this is getting a bit boring. We always end up coming back to the same place. But the reason we always end up coming back to the same place is anybody working in this space is always bumping up against those same problems. They're always saying, I want to make the business case for this investment. I understand the business case. I understand the wider economic case. But because the co-benefits aren't properly priced, and because the pollution is not properly priced, it doesn't quite stack up as an investment yet compared to more fossil fuels. That's a market failure. The government needs to fix the market failure. Or, and this is the one that's really frustrating, even when you get to the point where the investment does make sense, you have either short-termism at a business in terms of just having to hit the quarterly numbers, so you're under-investing, so you don't make an investment that makes sense. Or it's like, well, this wind farm is definitely cheaper and better than that gas-fired power station. I can't get planning approval for the wind farm. I can't get a grid connection for the electric vehicle chargers. I can't get planning approval to improve the energy efficiency of my house, but I can to stick another gas boiler in and keep polluting. It's kind of, so you kind of have the transition at the moment is this battle between these immense macro forces of the technology curve and the S-curve adoption bumping into NIMBYs and planning constraints and market failures. And who's going to win that fight will determine whether we're on track for a 1.6, 1.7 degree world or a 2.8, 2.93 degree world. And again, we don't talk openly enough about how terrifying that is, because those not even worst case, those kind of mid to upper worst case scenarios are absolutely terrifying in terms of the risk impacts that could flow from them.
Hey, here are some ads to help pay the bills. If you'd prefer a version without ads, subscribe to our member feed at wickedproblems.earth. A monthly subscription is cheaper than buying us a pint.
There's so much I could unpack there, but I want to pick you up on that last point, because it's something I struggle with in terms of doing this job and trying to comment and interview different people in the sector, because I think there's this tension between, as you say, we don't talk about it enough, but when I talk to people who are in doing climate science or doing some of the things, they're very conflicted, because they are afraid that the more they talk about how bad it could really get in the middle case, not even the worst case, that it's just makes people shut off. It makes people stop listening, which then can wind up impeding the transition and actually making the problem worse. So I mean, they find themselves, I think, often in this position where they're terrified of talking about the reality of what the numbers are telling them, without either being accused of being alarmist and going off the deep end on the one hand, or on the other hand, downplaying it in order to not scare people into inaction. So I feel for them, because there's not really a right answer about how to do it. But I think that people who are covering and reporting on this do have a responsibility to try to tell it as it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there is no right answer, and I find this whole thing quite frustrating. I think all this stuff around kind of behaviour change and the sort of socioeconomic side of it and how people respond. If you want to get right into the weeds of it, there's a massive replication crisis in so much of the research that's gone into this thing, because no one really seems to know anything. We're all so different. This is some people respond to terrifying messages with real courage and motivation, and fight or flight. They want to fight. That gets them motivated. Other people, it does make them despondent or hedonistic, or think, what's the point? There's no right or wrong there. That's just the way everyone's brains and personalities are slightly differently wired. I remember a wonderful piece, I think it was Zoe Williams in The Guardian years ago. It's weird how certain lines stick with you. She was talking about how something was positioned as high risk, as if that was a bad thing. And she was like, well, some people love bungee jumping and extreme sports, and actually high risk is something that pulls them in. This is not, we can't assume that there's sort of a standardized response to all these things. And this was, it was the theory for years and years, wasn't it? That you don't scare people, that you don't make it too downbeat and too worrying, and you need to give this optimistic story. And I subscribe to that to a degree. But the most high profile sort of breakthrough, I think, in terms of public discourse on climate was Greta Thunberg coming along and saying, tell the truth. I am not going to sugarcoat this, tell the truth. And there's risks of going too far. There's a big debate about whether the risk is existential or just incredibly bad. Is it going to kill the entire of humanity, or is it just going to destroy modern civilization? I just find that it's just a ridiculous esoteric lecture and debate, isn't it? It doesn't mean anything. It's just but what we do know is that the long tail risks of truly disastrous outcomes are absolutely there, and certainly even the kind of mid-case scenario could throw all global development into reverse if you do start to lose the world's major food production regions. If you do, just one little example from recently, if the Panama Canal does dry up, which is actively happening at the moment, what does that do to global trade? there was. I mean, I could go through such a long list, but there was a Twitter thread this week. I can't remember who wrote it, about Las Vegas's water situation. And it went a bit viral, and it was absolutely terrifying. The guy was saying, look, this entire corner of the US, one of its biggest cities, is served by fresh water coming down from the Rockies. And the extraction for years and years has been far too high. The water level in those lakes is falling. If it gets to a disaster point, there is no, it's too far inland for desalination to work. What happens then? And what I find when talking about these risks, what people never do, or what they don't do nearly effectively enough, is you get these scientific reports that go, oh, here's this big red zone where things are going to go horribly wrong. You never look at the second order impacts from that. So the entire global financial system basically collapsed in 2008, essentially because a very relatively small number of subprime mortgages in Texas and Florida defaulted. Well, what happens if the whole of Las Vegas is suddenly worthless? You kind of forget about the human impacts, or don't forget about the human impacts, they'd be horrible as well, but the financial impact that would flow from all those assets being written off could absolutely topple the financial system. And these are not insane sci-fi scenarios. These are entirely plausible scenarios on 20 to 30, 40-year timelines, which is not that far.
No, and I think that it does feel to me like there's an emerging kind of inflection point where people talking more about adaptation, and that's going to be actually driven by this better appreciation of risk and risk pricing. Because that was the other day. I was at an event at Climate X, who is an interesting little startup. I think they're about to raise their A, where they're essentially exactly that moment about 2008 is what actually motivated them to do this work in terms of looking at how to, and most of their customers are in the kind of financial services community, some of the bigger banks, about how to price, asset risk and figure out, are there adaptation strategies, for the particular bound down to one property, down to the building, but what happens if, like you say, Las Vegas doesn't have water and you wind up in some Mad Max dystopia where, there's a novel called The Water Knife, where, you've got these little wars breaking out in the southwestern United States about, who actually gets the water and who doesn't. Or, you're in East Anglia and, where we've baked in 5 meters of sea level rise, it seems like at this point. So there's going to be changes to the coastline. That's just going to happen. And our, price is actually appropriately gauged for what world's going to look like. And so the question is whether or not we're going to see a big shock of a repricing of risk, as we did in 2008, or whether or not there's going to be an orderly transition, as it were. So that both makes me optimistic about the fact that we could see people taking this more seriously when risk asset prices get changed. But at the same time, we have a history as a species of not really want to look at these things until the last possible moment.
Yeah. And that is the big worry, is that there's this lag time on these decisions that has that impact down the line. But I think one of the encouraging things of the last few years, particularly since Paris, is there is now this consensus that big changes are coming. And the argument isn't around whether or not big changes are coming. The argument is what's the pace and scale and how do we manage them? And there's a lot of wishful thinking going on around that. But none of this stuff will be a surprise. I mean, the one that gets me again is, and the team there have been banging on about this for as long as Business Green's been going, the carbon bubble hypothesis, the team at Carbon Tracker, that have just pointed out over and over again, if you want to get to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which, remember, every single government in the world has committed to, they have said that's their strategy in all of the world's biggest economies. I mean, if you look at the big four that are going to determine the future of the century, it's the US, China, India, and the EU. They are all, essentially their growth strategy is built around renewables and clean tech and clean energy. And also you don't actually have to meet the targets of the Paris Agreement. You've just got to kind of get in the ballpark. If you just even get vaguely close to them, the implications for the investment plans of the fossil fuel companies, the world's largest and most influential companies in many ways, the two are just not compatible. So you are either going to have 3 degrees plus of warming, or they are going to have to write off vast, vast swathes of their assets because the two are not compatible. And that's it. Those are the choices. And actually, there is a third choice, and we're going to hear a lot more in the coming years about carbon removals and carbon capture as this kind of get out of jail free thing that will square the circle. I think carbon capture and carbon removals are hugely important. I think they are going to have a massive role to play, but they are not big enough to make those fossil fuel investment plans make sense. They're just absolutely not. Every electric bus, and that's a booming market now, is destroying fossil fuel demand. Every electric vehicle is destroying fossil fuel demand. Every heat pump is destroying fossil fuel demand. All this stuff is coming. It's already happening. And if you're an investor in those companies and that industry, God, how can you not look at this and not be worried? And in 10, 15 years' time, when the impacts start to be felt on their bottom line and on their valuations, they won't be able to say they weren't warned, because they are being warned every single day.
I mean, and as the leader of a media organization that's covering this, assiduously, what are the kind of signals that you and your team look for in terms of an idea about whether or not, those questions of pace and scale, about whether or not we're headed, what are the things that things might move quickly or more slowly?
The thing is, the problem with it is we do joke in the office that we cover the economy and the environment, which means we cover everything. So it is just so broad. There are so many sort of metrics and points that you can look to that kind of suggest this shift is happening. I think the electric vehicle one's really interesting because that's just so easy to track. You can just see the sales, you can see the market share. These technologies, people said that's never going to happen. There were people not that long ago saying this will never be normalized, this technology will never be dominant. And you just have to walk out on your street to see they are now 10, 20, 30% of the fleet. And as I said, every single one is destroying fossil fuel demand. So I think that's an interesting tipping point. The renewables and the clean energy share, again, there were some absolutely startling stats from the EU recently that, renewables are close to the dominant source of power. And again, you do have to think back. We're so stuck in the moment, but 10 years ago, it was unthinkable. You were still hearing these arguments that renewables will never provide more than 10, 15, 20% of a modern grid. And in some countries, it's up to 60, 70%. And done in a way that is, going back to what we started on, done in a way that hasn't pushed up energy bills. In fact, in some ways, has often brought them down, or has certainly enhanced energy security and reduced energy price volatility, which is another crucial underreported fact about how stable energy prices would help unlock investment. Anyway, that's a whole other thing. So I think that's a really important one. The one I think everyone's waiting on, and the one that I think is could really change our perception of this whole thing, is global emissions. Are we at a peak? There's lots of reasons we are very, very close to a peak. Although I've also been writing stories about reports saying we're close to a peak for about 7-8 years now. Ever since Paris, when there was that initial decoupling of emissions growth and economic growth, people have said, "Oh, we're close." But I know this time, this is what everyone says, but this time, we really do seem to be very close. There was a report out recently that said if it hadn't been for lower than expected hydropower generation in China, caused by climate change, by the way, that's a whole other issue, emissions would have peaked last year. So potentially they're going to peak this year, 2025. It's almost inconceivable that they don't peak before 2030. And you do wonder what happens when they peak, what happens to kind of that, investment calculations, what happens to future projections. And we don't know. We don't know what will happen. If it peaks and it's a plateau, then we're in a world of trouble. But is that the point at which things really start to roll?
Well, and I think to your point, and one of the reasons I enjoy reading coverage in Business Green is that you guys do look at this in the round. And so, as we were talking, I was just looking up to see, how you guys are tracking people like Macquarie, the investment bank, and their holdings in the gas networks, domestic gas networks here in the UK. And you see some signs of either in concentration or, trying to dump a stake in, some networks because there's, at some point, someone's got to make a decision about whether to switch that off, or to imagine that you're going to put hydrogen through it. But it's still a kind of a toss-up, kind of a jump ball at the moment about whether or not that's going to happen, or when.
Yeah.
But it's those kind of signals, I think, as well. And so people should be reading Business Green to be able to get some of those things. And so let's talk about something positive. Let's talk about the awards that you guys have launched today, this morning, Friday, March the 8th, with Women in Green. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so for years we've done our main Business Green Awards, which we rebranded a couple of years ago as the UK Green Business Awards, celebrating the green economy as a whole. We think that's really important. We think it is important to showcase what's going on. I think one of the reasons, all the stuff we've been talking about, one of the reasons it's not going faster is it's not visible enough and it's not celebrated enough. So, as a media organisation, we're lucky enough to have a platform, and we've done that for years of trying to sort of showcase the really fantastic work that's going on. And I shouldn't really be talking about this. My colleague Cecilia should be talking about this more than me, but we launched a sister awards to it called the Women in Green Business Awards, launched today, International Women's Day. And it's the same sort of argument of everything that we do at Business Green, really. There's an injustice here. And, as reporters and journalists, we want to report on what's happening and help in our own way to try and make the world a better place. So there's definitely, the fact that even in the green economy, which are inherently broadly progressive organisations, modern organisations, there's still, inequality and a lack of diversity, both in terms of women and gender, and in terms of race also. So, we want to sort of shine a spotlight on that. But also there's a real kind of economic factor to this, is that there is this green skills gap, and there is also a really big complex challenge underway, and it's been shown time and time again that you want diverse voices. You don't want male dominated boards making the decisions that impact everyone. You kind of need the diverse voices, and also we need to plug the skills gaps that are out there, and it seems ridiculous to ignore half the population. So we just thought, we've already covered a lot about these issues, but we thought an awards would be a really nice positive way to celebrate and showcase the great work that so many women are doing across the green economy. Create a network, hopefully, allow people to come together and share their experiences and best practices and advance things, and as I said, also provide that celebration and that showcase of the great work that's going on, and hopefully help raise the profile of best practices and encourage more to do so. So we've launched that today. Please do nominate people, nominate yourself, and then we're going to have a fantastic judging panel of really respected people across the sector. And we'll be having an awards ceremony in early October. So it's a new venture. Hopefully it'll work. But we do think there's a gap in the market for it. We do think it will serve an important purpose, and hopefully help tackle one of the many challenges that the green economy faces.
Well, and look, we'll definitely put that link in the show notes so people can get more information about that. Nominate their people that they'd like to see get more attention, and their stories be told. So the other thing, of course, we're about, we're on, I guess, the year's slipping away from us very rapidly, James. And so, your annual Net Zero Festival has already kind of started. You must be starting to think about that. What can you tell us about what this year is going to be like?
Yeah, so we're having a launch party actually later this month, which I must invite you, Richard, if I haven't already. I'll send you the link. But we're having a small launch party. It's going to kick off. So later this month, we'll be sort of announcing a bit more about the agenda, the plans. Is happening on October 21st and 22nd at the Business Design Centre in Islington once again. It's going to be bigger and better. I mean, the sector just keeps getting bigger, and the challenges keep getting bigger at the same time as the opportunities keep getting bigger. So we're going to have more stages. We've got a bigger space. We're going to continue to try and have that positive atmosphere that we've always had around it. We've always said it is a festival. We want to sort of celebrate and showcase the really exciting stuff that's going on, the fantastic businesses and projects, and the cultural side of it as well, the kind of the communication side and reaching out to as broad a constituency as possible. We're also going to have, it'll be free to attend, but we're actually going to have a paid for stream as well that will go into slightly more in-depth workshops for senior sustainability executives. That's part of our Business Green Intelligence package on Business Green. We're going to have a Business Green Intelligence stage, and that'll be looking in more detail at some of the technical things, starting to get into the weeds of how do you engage your supply chain to tackle your Scope 3 emissions. What do you need to know about the upcoming policy environment? How do you develop a strategy that gets your board in support of net zero investments, building the business case, all these issues that time and time again, when we talk to CSOs and other senior sustainability executives, they say, like, this is the pain point. These are the issues I really need to address, and we're going to try and put together a program that tackles some of those and gives people that chance. And also it's just, it's a sphere for people to come together as well and network. I think that's, something that got lost a little bit in those pandemic years, but we had over 1,500 people there last year each day. And it's such a great community, and so many people have these shared challenges. It's an area in which, yes, there's competition, but there's also immense opportunity for cooperation and, sharing those best practices. So, yeah, we're excited about it. It should be a good event. It's been going. It's 5th year now. Actually, it's going 5 years. So we're looking to really, as I say, take it up another level.
Well, I certainly got a lot out of it when I was able to attend last year, and looking forward to this year's new version of it. I suppose one of the questions I would have as well is, are you going to invite anyone from XR to be on a panel?
Yeah. Well, they turned up anyway, didn't they? They you referenced at the start. They stormed the stage and protested during one of our sessions, which feels a bit strange when you've got a net zero event and you're trying to advance the net zero cause and you're getting attacked for doing so. But you can't. Everyone has their right to free speech and so on. So we can't. Would we invite them? I don't know. We'll have a think about what we do. What we've always said is, with the net zero transition, we've always understood, and I think everyone in the space needs to understand, there are different theories of change, and there are different in every social change movement. There's different tactics that all need to work in an interlocking way, not in a coordinated way, but they do work alongside each other. So if you go back to the great social change movements, whether it's universal suffrage or the civil rights movement, you have an inside game and a kind of and an outside game. You have those people taking to the streets, and I have nothing but respect for them. Those brave people willing to risk everything to raise the profile of a cause and make those arguments in the case of justice. But then you do also need the businesses and the investors and the policymakers trying to work out how to bring the whole of society along and do this in a way that doesn't trigger those backlashes, that puts the movement back. And it's inevitable there'll be tensions between those different spheres, because this stuff is really important. Everyone cares passionately about it, and there are different theories of change about how it goes about. And I think that is ultimately to be welcomed, because also it's never going to change. It's just the way human societies work. And I think the protests have played such an important role in the last 5 years, in particular, of pushing it up the agenda, keeping it up the agenda, highlighting how severe the threats are and why we need to go faster. And then that does become a challenge to the people like myself who reports on business and reports on politics, and the people I report on, that you've got to rise to that challenge. You can't dismiss it. You can't ignore it. These are legitimate concerns being made in good faith. And I do think some of the critiques of some of the protest movements from people just underplay that, and I think it's shameful, really, that you dismiss their cause because you disagree with the tactics. It should be possible for government and others to say, and there was a period when the government was doing this a bit better. It was saying, look, we disagree with the tactics, we don't agree with breaking the law, but we understand that the feeling, and we are doing our best, and we want to do more. And they've kind of shelved that and gone into this more sort of oppositional focus, which I don't think benefits anyone. I think there should be a more positive, progressive way of realising that ultimately we're all on the same side here, even if we want a slightly different tactics and how it goes about happening.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would very much in line with your thinking on this. And when I was talking to a German activist, Tadzio Müller, who got actually has a PhD from Sussex, but he is, we had him on the show, one of our most popular episodes, where possibly because he was so bleak, really, in the outlook, but and had some interesting things to say about climate tech in general. But I suppose I proposed to him this idea of using the popular front model, of the idea that you've got, again, it's not coordinated, but you do have enough things in common where you are on the same side, and realizing that, maybe train your fire in a slightly different direction than necessarily the people who actually are closest to you in your goals. But anyway, look, I really appreciate the time you've given us today, James. And as I mentioned, I know for a fact that there are media training and presentation courses around the country that are using that video and your clip of how you handled that moment when the stage was stormed. Because again, it just was respectful. It gave people space to talk, to make their point, and then you insisted on, as you're right, as the chair and the host, to be able to get on with the panel discussion that people came to hear in the first place. And I thought, again, it was just completely unplanned. But if you had to plan it, it would be hard to see how it could have gone better.
Thank you very much. No, it was a slightly dramatic moment, slightly disorientating moment, but no, it did. I think that's what you've got to do, isn't it? I think people, there are different views, and we've got to hear them, and hopefully that helps advance what everyone's trying to achieve in this space.
Well, absolute legend. And last thing before I let you go, because I know we're up against time, are there any things that you might recommend for our listeners that you've read, watched, listened to that have kind of shaped your views as you've gone these past almost 20 years doing this?
Oh, geez, there's so many. I mean, the obvious ones, I think anyone who's sort of worked on climate change has probably read or heard recommended many times, The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells. I think it's just an absolute masterpiece. It was one of those. I remember reading it, and I was there's a wonderful line that Jon Stewart said about the Book of Mormon, the musical that came out on The Daily Show. And he had the people on who wrote it, and he said, "This is so good, it makes me angry." And as a writer and as a journalist, I read Dave Wallace Wells' book, and I was just like, I've been writing about this stuff for years. There's a combination of pure envy, but also just anger at the situation, because it's just, it was just a brilliant piece of long-form journalism, and it really did spell out the true scale of the risks that we're facing, and really nothing much has changed on that front. I mean, there's still the worst case scenarios are terrifying and deserve more attention. So that's an amazing one. I remember I read years ago George Monbiot's Heat, which is one of the first books to try and spell out how we could get to a net zero emission economy. I imagine it's been overtaken by a lot of the technologies, but again, I'm a huge fan of George Monbiot's work. And more recently, Akshat Rathi's book on climate capitalism, it takes a different approach, but as for an upbeat read, that's fantastic. I haven't read Hannah Ritchie's book, which is along similar lines yet, but I hear that is also a really interesting read on the sort of optimistic take on things. I think that's a hugely important. I could go on and on. Dave Roberts as well. I mean, David Roberts in the US, I think, is just an incredible thinker on this stuff, and I read him an awful lot. I think, his views on politics and the way the transition is playing out is just really, really important and deep thinking on this stuff. But yeah, there's so much good content now. I mean, when we started, we were out there on our own, but now there's just reams and reams of fantastic writing on the climate crisis and the transition. So it's I could go on and on recommending great pieces of work.
I want to thank you and the team for all the work that you do and how long you've been doing it, because I think it's been, like you said, when you started, you were a lonely, it was a lonely patch to be on, and now, it's a little more crowded, but I think that you guys have maintained a standard of coverage and quality that I think everyone should take note of and aspire to. So thanks all for all that work, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. That's great to hear. Thanks. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Wicked Problems, made possible through the generosity of people like you. If you like this conversation, please share it and give us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like an ad-free version of this podcast, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll also get our newsletter, all our show notes, member-only goodies, and you'll be supporting media that wants to tell the stories at the frontier of climate tech, where people, politics, technology, and capital meet and shape the future, and whether it's one you'd want to be in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan. Production assistance was provided by me, Theodore Delavan. Wicked Problems, Climate Tech Conversations is a product of Wicked Problems Limited. Thanks again for listening.
Perfectientur interrupit